Hello developers. So before I begin this video, I just want to thank everyone for all the love and support that they have been showing me. So thanks to everyone who's giving the videos a like and commenting and subscribing. So yeah, I hope you enjoy this video. So first of all, I want to go through the main differences between Redux and context. So context allows you to share state globally between your components, just like Redux does. But the main difference is that with Redux, it's good for large applications because when you change a specific property in Redux, it will change. It will update all the states, all the components. Sorry, it will update all the components for that specific property that they are bound to. Whereas with context, when the context state is changed, then all of the components that are connected to that context, all the components that are connected to the context, they will be re-rendered, all of them. Whereas in Redux, only the ones that are connected to that property would be re-rendered, and only that property would be re-rendered. So that's mainly the differences between context and Redux. So Redux is good for large applications because it is more efficient and it's more optimal, whereas React context is good for small applications because when you have many re-renderings, when you re-render a lot of components, especially when you have thousands of components, like if you have a large list, then it can be quite expensive computationally. So let's get into the context. So the application that I will be building in this tutorial is just a small counter. It's just mainly for demonstrating how the context works. So it's not going to look pretty at all, it's just going to be just functional. So when I press increment, it's going to increment the counter. When I click decrement, it's going to decrement the counter. And when I click reset, it will reset it to 0. So before we start coding, I just want to mention that I have a few courses on Udemy, and specifically I have a React course where we go through 5 projects, and the course has received over 10,000 enrollments and fantastic reviews. So if you are interested in enrolling into the course, the link is in the description. So let's head over to Code Sandbox and let's make a new sandbox for a React application. And so I have this Code Sandbox set up for our React application. And first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make 2 folders inside source. And the first one is going to store our reducer and our context global state. So I'm going to call this context. So I'll just keep it small letters, context. And inside it I will make a new file called global state.js. And I will make a new file called app.reducer.js. Now let's get coding let's first code the global state. So first of all, we want to import the create context and use reducer from React. So let's go ahead and do that. And use reducer. And we will import it from React. Now let's make an initial state object for our global context. So let's just do a new variable called const initial state, and we're just going to have just one property for that initial state, and that will be the counter. And for the counter, we'll just initialize it with a value of 0. After that, we want to now initialize the global context. I just found out that I was recording using my MacBook mic. I have now switched to the external mic, so if you notice the voice difference, that is why. Okay, so now let's carry on with this application. Now I'm going to implement the create context. So let's make a context using this initial state. So to do this, we're just going to make a new variable, and we're also going to export it so that we can import it inside the other components. So we're just going to do export const global context, and we will initialize this using create context, which we have imported over here from React, and I will just pass in the initial state. Should not give me an error. It's not defined. Oh, I have misspelled the create context over here, so make sure to spell it correctly. So now let's define our global state, and to do this I'm just going to do export. So I'm going to just implement this functional component global state, and I'm just going to do export const, and this is going to be the global provider. I'll just call it global state actually to match this name of the file. So we'll do global state, and it's going to take a prop called children, and this is going to basically whatever I'm passing in. I will explain this later, the children part. So now I'm going to implement the reducer so that the reducer is applied to the global state. And to do this I'm just going to do const, and going to have the state and dispatch. So the state is going to be the global state that I am receiving from the reducer, and the dispatch will allow me to dispatch the actual actions on the global state. And now I can get these from the user reducer, and the user reducer will take in two arguments. It will take in the reducer and the initial state. So let's pass in the app reducer, which I will have to implement in a minute. So let's do app reducer and the initial state. So now let's go ahead and implement this app reducer. Let's actually change the name from app reducer to counter reducer, as it is a much better name. So let's call it counter reducer. And over here as well, let's see if this, let's change it over here as well, rename counter reducer. Now for the counter reducer, we need to, first of all, we need to import the initial state from the global state. This is so that we can so if we want to reset the app reducer, we will just return the initial state. So we will reset the state back when the user presses the reset button. So now let's implement this. Let's implement the reducer, and we can just do export default. We don't even have to name it, or we can name it if we want to, but in this case I'm just going to do export default and implement the arrow function, which will have the state passed in and the action, and then we can reduce the action. So we can just implement a switch statement that will take the action. It will take the action type, and then based on the action type we will perform the state changes. So we're going to have three cases. We're going to have one case if the user is passing in the increment action, or another case if he's passing in the decrement action, or the third case, which is if he's trying to reset the counter. So let's implement the increment action. Let's just do it capitals, and in this case we're just going to return the state. So returning the copy of the state. So when we're doing ... that will return whatever we already have, but we are updating one thing, which is the counter. In this case we only have the counter property anyway, so it's kind of trivial, but when you have many properties then it will be then it will make sense. But so we're just updating the counter. Sorry, Control Z. And for the counter we're just getting what already is in state for the counter, and we're incrementing it by 1. And we can do that for the decrement as well, so just copying and pasting here and changing from increment to decrement. So if we are receiving the decrement action, then we can do the same thing, but for the counter we are decrementing it by 1 instead of incrementing it by 1. And finally, so it's giving us yellow lines is because it wants us to return a default value, which is the initial state, or it's going to be the state. So let's go ahead and do that default. So we're just going to return the state. So that's why when it's first initialized, it will just return whatever the initial state is, and this will be passed in here. So we're just returning the state if we do not have any of the actions that are given to us. So if the action.type is none of those cases, then it will just return the state. Finally, we also need to check if the action type is reset, and in this case we will just return the initial state. Yeah, we can just return the initial state. So now that we have finished the counter reducer, we have finished implementing it, now we can actually use it inside our global state. So let's go back to our global state, and inside this global state, now what we can do is we can import the counter reducer. It should find it for us, and it has automatically imported it for us from counter reducer over here. So now that we have done that, so the next step is going to be implementing the actual types, the actual action types. So we're just going to do it under here. So we're going to have 3 action types, which is increment, decrement, and reset counter. So as you can see over here, the reducer is checking for these 3 types, and we want to define these action types inside our global state. So to do this, I'm just going to implement these functions. So function increments. So we'll just do increment counter, and let's implement this action. It will just return an object, and we want to use the dispatch function. So it will actually it will dispatch the increment action on the reducer, and the reducer will receive this increment action over here, and it will return the whatever we have, and it will return the new state with the counter being updated. And if it's a decrement, then it will decrement it and reset. It will set it back to the initial state. So let's go ahead and implement the increment function. So we're just going to be dispatching an event, an action. So we will dispatch an action of type increment. Let's just copy and paste the increment over here just to make sure we don't have any spelling mistakes. And let's copy and paste this for the other actions as well. So that's increment counter. Now let's change this to decrement counter, and let's change this to reset counter. And let's also change these types. Let's copy the decrement, and let's do reset over here. Now we should be done with our actions, and now we can use these actions to perform the necessary state changes. So after we have done these actions, now we need to pass them in to our global context provider. So this global context, this global state component, it will return a global context provider. So over here we will be returning. So we have the global context over here. This global context, it also has a provider, so we can return it over here. So we can do global context dot provider, and let's close this over here. And then whatever children we are passing into global state, we want to pass them over here. So we can just do children right over here. Let's change this to a capital letter because it's a component, and so let's refactor this one as well over here. Okay, so for some reason it's giving me one line, which is not really an issue. So the children the children are basically components that are passed inside the context provider. Because we're going to be using this to wrap around the entire application, then we will be receiving the components inside as children, and we can pass it into the global context provider. That way the global state can be wrapped around all the components inside it, and the state can be actually shared between all the components inside it. So next we need to pass in these actions and the state as well. We need to pass that into the global context provider, so that all the components that are using this context, they will be able to use the global state and the actions, and they can change the state using these actions and see the current state using the state. So let's just pass in the value prop over here. We should be value, and then we can pass in an object, and this object will contain the state. It will contain the increment counter, the decrement counter, and the reset counter. So the next thing we want to do is now we want to use this global context provider inside our app.js, so that all the components that are wrapped around it, they can now use the context that we are providing, and the global context will be used globally. So let's go back to our app.js, and inside this let's delete these headings. We do not need them, and let's even delete this div as well. Now let's just do global context, global state. Yeah, should be global state. Let's see what we called it. So the global state, it will return this global context. So let's just now import the global state, and let's close the tags now. Let's save it so it's formatted. And inside this global state, now I can pass in a new component. So I'm going to implement a new component called the counter, and let's go ahead and implement it. So it's undefined because it's giving me error because I haven't made it. So let's make a new folder inside the source folder, and let's call it components. And inside the components, I'm just going to make a new file called counter.js. Let's make this capital. And so let's define this counter.js component. So we are just going to do export const counter, and it's just going to implement the arrow function. It's a functional component, and let's return just a heading for now. So h1, and let's give it a title, counter. I see nothing was returned from Windows. Okay, so let's see the issue over here. Let's do export default. Well, we can't do that because we have to. We can do this export default counter, and let's go to app.js. Oh, because now we haven't imported it. So let's import it now, and that should import it for us from component/counter. So why is it giving us those yellow lines? So we have two small issues. The first one is this: the code sandbox automatically did this for me. So it's meant to be returning a JSX component, but it was actually returning nothing. So now that's one of the issues. And the second issue is we need to go to global state. I have wrapped the children with two parentheses. It should be just single parentheses on each side. And now we are getting the counter. So the counter is actually being rendered now over here. So for the counter now, we want to actually connect the counter to the global state. And to do this, we can just import use context. Import use context from React. So we need to import use context so that we can actually use the context, use the global context that I already explained here in the global state. So we need to import the global context, and then we can pass it inside the use context, and it will actually initialize our context with the global context, and then we can access the states, the global states that are provided to us from the context provider. So let's go back to our counter.js, and so now that we have imported use context, now inside this counter functional component, we can now do. So let's do const. So this will allow us to get the actual elements from the context provider. So we can access them now using. So let's do use context, and then we can pass in the global context. So the global context is taking is taken from the global state over here. That's why I said, if you remember, I told you to use the export, so we can actually access this global context from all the other components. Yeah, so let's go back to our counter now, and we can access this global context, and we can pass it inside the use context. So we are just doing, so as I write global context, it should automatically import it for me over here, and that's why it imported it for me over here. And I can pass it inside the use context hook, and now I can actually get the state. I can get whatever the context provider is providing. So it's providing the state. If you remember here, in the global state over here, I am providing the state, the increment counter, all the actions that I have defined over here. These are now available to the other components. So if I go to the counter, and I can now access the state, I can access the increment counter, I can simply just copy and paste this actually. So this entire object, I can now access all of these actions and state. So I can just paste it over here, and now have access to the increment counter, decrement counter, and reset counter action, and as well as the state. So right under this, so instead of the h1, let's now return a JSX element. Let's wrap everything inside the div. Says counter. Something is not right. Let's see what's the issue. Oh, that's because same thing. I don't know why Code Sandbox does that for me, but it's meant to be like this. Yes. So now after the counter, I'm going to make another heading h1, and now I'm going to take the actual counter from the global state. So I'm just going to do state.counter, and it's currently set to 0. And then after that, I'm going to have 3 buttons. So the first button is for incrementing, and the second button is for decrementing, and the last one is for resetting. So let's do the last one, reset. This one is I'll just do decrement, and over here we'll do increments rather than incrementing. So now when we press the increment button, we want it to increment the counter, so we can simply just do on click, sorry, not on can play, on click, and we can implement this, and now we can just call the increment counter. We can call it as a function, and now if I press it, as you can see, the counter is being incremented. And now we need to do the decrement as well. So let's implement the onClick function here. And we will call the decrement counter, and for resetting we will need to do the reset counter. And now if I press the increment button, it's incrementing, decrementing, and reset. Reset should give us, should make the counter 0. Something is not right. So let's go back to our reducer, and we should return a copy of the initial state. But why is it not? In this case, let's just do counter 0, and let's make the counter back to 0. So incrementing, decrementing, and reset gives us back to 0. Yes. So it's working as it should be. So just to prove that the state is shared globally now, we can make a new component. So I'm just going to make another counter. So we'll call it counter global state check.js, and let's just do export default. She's going to return a function is going to be a functional component over here, and we want to do the same thing. So we want to just like what we've done for counter, we want to get the use context and the global context, and then get this as well. So in the counter global state check, we want to now first import use context from React, and then we want to initialize, we want to get the context using the use context. So let's do const equals use context, and then we need to get the global context so that we can actually use the global context, and the use context will allow us to use the values from the global context, and the values are state. So we can get this increment counter, decrement counter, but we don't really want the actions right now. All we care about is the global state. So let's just return just a heading 1, and let's just display the state.counter. So now as I update this, so let's also include this inside our inside the app.js. So just like we have counter, let's also put in counter global state check, and that should be imported from components right over here. It automatically imported it for us, and now we have this this counter from the global state counter. So let's just do a heading 1. Well, let's do that actually inside the counter here, inside here. Let's drop this in a div. My battery is almost about to run out, so let's almost done. And let's just do a heading 2. Let's do heading 1 actually. So now the global state, so if I press increment, and as you can see, this is also updating. Decrement is also decrementing, and reset. So the state is being shared globally between all the components. So I hope you have enjoyed this video, and if you want to check out my Udemy course, I also have a Udemy course in the description if you want to learn, if you want to go through a few React projects. So you can enroll into the course using the link in the description. So if you run into any issues, just message me the issue that you have, and hopefully I can help you with it. So yeah, apart from that, take care guys, and I hope you have enjoyed this video.